Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how we can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org.
How would you categorize the relationship between imagination and innovation, and perhaps even entrepreneurship?
Okay, so creativity, it's the ability to think differently, think of something different. Okay, it's a personal ability. Okay, innovation is the ability to get a group of people to adopt your idea as a new best practice. So it's an external thing on influencing people, hopefully with an idea that actually has some basis to it. And design is innovation under constraints. So it's, creating a business is a design problem. It has to have profit. It has to be able to hire the right people and get the right skills. So design is innovation, but under constraints. So you use the word imagination, and I'm thinking that it's the same thing as my use of the word creativity, the ability to think different, something different that you haven't thought of before. You may have to do it on the spot, or you may do it while you're in the shower, or it doesn't matter, but you should figure out how that works.
But you can imagine things that aren't different as well, right?
Right, you can imagine things that aren't different. Imagine the future, which you may imagine as being reflections of some things in the past, wouldn't be different. And so that, I guess, would be a very good distinction about how imagination and creativity are not exactly aligned.
I tend to think about a lot of things in terms of system constraints. So when I think of innovation, it's a reaction to a system and its constraints, where I have limited resources, or there's competition, or there's history, tradition, hope for the future. That somehow that hope and that desire to be new is somehow bound by a system. And so you're doing something new and creating newness within that system, whereas I was staring at this sheet for a while because I only had a sound effect for it at the beginning, and I figured the experts could provide some sort of context. But to me, imagination is like, poof, and this kind of transcendence of constraint, or not ignorance of it, maybe ignorance not in the negative sense, but just doesn't need to be aware of. Where, and at first I thought, imagination is the umbrella and innovation is one thing under it. But I actually, to me, thinking about it as innovation responding to system constraints or system hopes, and imagination perhaps transcending those or not caring about those. I don't think imagination needs to have a purpose.
Could we just do it all together? Imagination is...
I love it. It makes a lot of sense.
Like my brain exploded. But maybe it's just one part of my brain.
When asked to think about imagination, I have to say that it's not something that I really thought about. And so my own style of when I'm addressing something is I start seeking out my friends and experts on the topic. So I started community conversations around imagination. And what I found was people do think, first of all, they think kind of fluff.
Think what?
Fluff. That's fluff. When I was a child, and maybe even now, I sometimes, think, what if I was a princess? And that's imagination. Or they think of it in the terms of art. is imagination in art. I was like, oh, is it like God or the Big Bang Theory that there's nothing, you have to create something out of nothing? And so that's, imagination. And then I think, oh, Maureen, how do you use your imagination? And I think for me, it's taking something and looking at how I can fit it in to an existing structure. How can I change something and make it work and be successful someplace else? But maybe that's what innovation is. So for myself, poof, is very, I get that picture right away of what that imagination
So
would look like.
play as a part of what you've just said.
I think we're taught, or at least I was taught, that there are rules, and you're taught to manage those rules and follow the rules, and then do things within the constraints of those rules. So being playful at work was, you never talked about being, playful or thinking differently. You thought, how can I just, follow the rules? So, I do see innovation as, something that changes things. So how can you make change? How can I get people more involved? How can I create a place where people are going to want to come and build their businesses? If I'm thinking about my city. Those are what things can I take, apply them to our community, because I have to understand the context in which I'm working. I understand my population, what it's like, what would work there, because certainly what would work maybe in my community, I don't think would work maybe in Philadelphia. So I think it's really understanding your audience. Also, I think that's really a very important part of that. And when I think about entrepreneurship, I think about, this may be very narrow, but I think about, that's taking an idea and then applying it to make money.
When I think about innovation from Derek's definition, and I think about how we get people to adopt our ideas, we usually start with some kind of doctrine, right? There's usually something written down that shapes our thinking. But where innovation comes to bear is somebody who's able to articulate that that's great, what's written down is wonderful. But when you think about, one of you said something about, victory, you said it, Scott, you talked about victory. Just like we're not 2.5 million people who all look and sound the same, victory doesn't look and sound the same. Victory certainly doesn't look the same to our political masters, right? But victory to us, we have to lead in such a way that victory doesn't mean everybody comes home safely. Victory means, I'll use the USS Fitzgerald. They're a forward presence to help maintain the peace. At one time, Japan, not too long ago, Japan and Korea, both Koreas, hated each other, and so we were a stabilizing influence. So the fact that the USS Fitzgerald is out patrolling the sea, leaders have to help their sailors. This is an example. The leader of the USS Fitzgerald is now they lost 7 sailors when they collided with a merchant vessel. The leader of that ship had to help his sailors first understand that they were innovating by the way they provided presence in the Middle East, or in the Far East rather. They had to innovate every day because they couldn't just use a bumper sticker. They needed to meet the crew where they were, help them understand why today we are in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, Tokyo Bay, wherever they happen to be. So it's very dynamic. It's a dynamic environment that they operate in, a little bit because technology is always changing, but the human mind is so adaptive that you have to take things that are given to you, like doctrine or political realities, and you have to help your crew. It has to stick with your crew.
And it's also interesting to me when we use these different words, because in OB and organizational behavior, creativity is coming up with new ideas. Innovation is implementing those new ideas. So for me, an entrepreneur really crosses that bridge or creates the bridge between creativity or imagination and innovation. So it seems like one catalyst to encouraging imagination is to encourage people to talk. And I'm wondering, for those of you in leadership positions, how do you reconcile what seems to be a stereotype that leaders should be the ones who are talking, and that we actually demonstrate our expertise and power through what we express? I tell my students there's this old theory where it says the person who talks the most is most likely to be chosen or regarded as the leader, regardless of the quality of that person's comments. And so I'm just curious, again, for those of you in these leadership roles, how do you teach leaders to actually talk less and listen more?
I have a definition of leadership that I use for this, and I say, hey, ultimately, a leader is someone who makes those around them feel they'll be successful. And so that's, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to realize you're here to make other people, the people around you, be successful. But being an entrepreneur, your benefit is that you're going to make them successful doing your idea. So it's this balance of being selfish, very, very selfish, and choosing, this is how I'm going to make the world change for me, in such a way that it makes all those around you successful. And so it's this balance between the total selfishness that's required to drive an entrepreneur to make the changes in themselves, to survive the crises and all the things that are required, and balanced with this selflessness that's required to keep people to be passionate about your idea.
That's really
and
interesting.
feel
Really
purpose for
interesting. You think it'd be the other way around, but it's
right.
not.
No, you got to be, selfishly selfless.
Yeah. I would argue that the great leaders, the ones that I've studied, are those that, I think you use the term selflessness. I would say reach a certain emotional level where they realize the success of their organization is no longer them, and they tend to not only delegate responsibility, but to delegate credit. And that's particularly difficult to do in war.
I was just going to briefly mention that there's some social psychological research looking at the motivations of people who have done acts of great moral courage. And a lot of the times when other people mention that they must be completely selflessly motivated, what they describe is a combination of really finding sort of personal interest in helping other people, so that there is this sort of synergistic combination of both kind of selfishness and also selflessness.
Yeah, the selfishness is required for the motive power to start. Yeah.
What is the leader's chalkboard? What are the tools that you use in your own field to foster imagination?
I've realized it's important to surround yourself with people who make you feel powerful. And I realize when I'm with people that I can feel safe with, to come up with new ideas, and know that when they offer feedback, it's in my best interests. That helps me be creative. I really want people who empower me, which is probably why I study empowering leadership. I think the village that you create, or the tribe that you surround yourself with, is so critical in helping to fuel your own free thinking. Imagination comes, I think, when your mind is relaxed. And as a stress scholar, I always worry about our students who seem to clamp down and won't even speak up in class, because within the Wharton community, there's a lot of peer pressure. And what if you say something and it's evaluated negatively? And so for me, the social aspect is critical. I want people who will support me. I want people who will take what I'm talking about and run with it, build on it, people who will understand the integrity and the essence of my thinking. I really, again, feel like that tribe perspective is what elevates my creative thinking.
So the idea of tribes, right? The idea of tribes is very powerful. And if you surround yourself only with members of your tribe, it really doesn't matter. Then you become a member of the tribe and you adopt the culture of the tribe, unless you deliberately bring in creativity, whether it's success or failure, unless you value creativity deliberately, the tribe culture is the tribe culture. And it's interesting, among the uniformed services, each is a little more tribal, each is tribal in a different way. Each values kind of meat eaters more than other things. So culture within a tribe, my experience is that you can deliberately, because I've seen tribes that do it quite successfully, you can bring new ideas in regardless of how you bring people to the table, but it's got to be part of the tribal culture.
There was a book that was written a long time ago. It's called Bringing Out the Best in People. There was a whole chapter in it about hang out with the people that you want to be like. And so that could mean, many different things. It can mean, you like them because you think they're a big thinker. You like them because they challenge you. It could be you like them because they think like you. But, surround yourself with people who bring out the best, or hopefully will bring out the best in you. So with that said, what I think one of my big ahas for this year, and this is probably, most people have already probably been there, but I realized that as a family, I'm a relatively new mother-in-law. So as a family, I realized, we have a culture as a family. And so you get a new son-in-law, and he sees everything beautiful about you, and then he sees everything wonky. And you're like, whoa, and so then all of a sudden you're taking a step back and you want to say, Mike, didn't you filter that when you before you said something to me? But that is the same thing about a community. So when you talk about a tribe, as a community, certainly in a small community, we have a culture in our community. And so we have a lot of new leaders who are running large organizations within our community who may not have, grown up in the company that they're in, but have come from someplace else. Well, again, they see everything beautiful about us and everything wonky. So again, I think that is surrounding yourself with people who you admire, who you are willing to learn from, who if they give you feedback, it's not, might be critical, but it's also constructive. And so I think that is trying to go in with an open mindset. And then I have I'm a collector of sayings that have been meaningful to me. And one is, I have it on my refrigerator, it's what you do when you don't feel like doing it that makes the difference between success and failure. There's days I go, okay, I really don't want to do that. But then I think, maybe it's intuitive, and I say, but I do need to do that because I know that that's what the difference is.
My chalkboard is writing. I write between 5 in the morning and 11 in the morning. I can't write after that. That's the only time I can write, and I try to write. Not anymore because I'm too old, but back in the day, I try to write 800 words a day. It doesn't even have to be on a subject that I'm driven to being paid to study. I write 800 words a day. It could be an op-ed, it could be a chapter in a book, piece of a chapter in a book. And then what I find is, particularly as I get older, if the thought jumps in my head and if I don't write it down and it's gone, what I learn is that it's gone forever. It's not retrievable. And I think that's also a function of age, dare I say it. But I have so many, I would have today a Pulitzer Prize if I just had a 5x7 card in my pocket. Because I could be in a train, an airplane, talking to somebody. Which is like the whole thing about, okay, Bob, don't teach failure, teach success. Whoa, never heard that before. But I did write it down. Because that could lead to something else. But if you don't write it down, don't trust your memory to retrieve it.
I try to sketch what it is that I need to do, and I turn it into creating a game. And sort of do sometimes it usually starts out as a snakes and ladder type, game, but then it can get more, intricate as I, do this and get additional ideas on, hey, this needs to be taken into account, and this might be an opportunity, and you go through quite a few iterations, throw it out and start over and make it look nicer.
I don't know that it's a chalkboard of sorts. I whether it's one or two people, you try to have somebody who's not exactly like you, but also we find it very helpful for the group of maybe, a small group, 3 or 4 people. Find it very helpful to sketch, maybe not in the same way, but to sketch out our ideas. Because one of the things we find is that when you say something, it conjures up visuals, different visuals to everybody. And so when we start either mind mapping or kind of sketching, not in an artistic way, but kind of sketching out how the ideas relate to each other, it's really helpful to get more ideas out of people, whether they're constraints or kind of offshoots of ideas. It's really helpful to bring the details to the forefront so we're not just talking in generalities, and I found that very helpful.
Would someone like to share a moment in leadership that they are proud of, that they really say is distinctive and almost a signature moment for you, and what role, if any, imagination played in that moment of leadership, in that exercise of leadership?
About a year ago, I started hosting a stress management workshop at our annual meeting called the Academy of Management, which probably some of you have heard of. And I came up with this because I felt like other professional development workshops offered at the conference weren't filling a particular niche. And I got heat for my idea, which I was surprised by one of the conference organizers, because up until I had that conversation with her, people seemed supportive. They felt like this was, again, creating unique value. We could bring a research-based perspective to the conversation. Last year, we did junior faculty. This year, we're doing it for doctoral students. But I remember when this organizer was questioning the intent, she was questioning whether it was unique, whether it was redundant, and she actually seemed to think that we weren't offering anything above and beyond what had already been done. And so it's challenging as a leader when you come up with a new idea, you feel like you're getting lots of positive feedback, you're very excited about it, and then someone comes in and says the equivalent of no. But even that for me was a learning moment, because it helped me understand how, as a leader, how you can reframe, how you can describe what you're going through or what you're coming up with. And I think it makes you a stronger leader, in fact, when you're challenged. And so what started out as a pretty painful conversation has ended up informing what we do. And I really tried to look at her feedback as constructive. So I feel like sometimes your best and your worst can get combined, and it can evolve depending on what moment you're in. Now, certainly the workshop has been accepted as a permanent fixture on the landscape, and we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from attendees last year, the junior faculty. Now, again, as I mentioned, we're going to students. So it was quite a journey. It didn't, in my mind, I wasn't expecting it to be as difficult as it kind of materialized, but I'm really grateful for it. And I think it just makes us more excited about kind of making the vision, translate to reality, and it helps us feel even more committed to continuing it.
Well, sometimes I think what comes easy to one person is really hard and painful for someone else. So when you have a great idea, you think, well, that's not so hard. Oh, come on. And then you think everybody could do it, but it's not true that everyone could do it. So, for example, back in 2009 when the market and everything was, everything was tight, especially in cities, you have no money to spend, and you're asking, you're saying you're going to raise taxes. Well, you're not the most popular people in the world. And it's very hard to keep talent when you can't pay talent. And we had an incredible city manager, and it was, so I just asked him, what do you need? And he said, you can't pay me, but I need something. So I said, okay. And I went out and raised money to start a fund, so he was able to go to the executive leadership program at Harvard and also for our county. Now, I've created some notoriety among all city managers in the state of Michigan because I raised this fund, and I'm thinking, well, that was nothing, but I think it was just listening. It was a combination of listening and thinking, well, I can do that. It wasn't so hard. But to everybody else, it was novel and unique. And so am I proud of that? Yeah, I'm proud of it. I guess maybe that was one of those intuitive things that I just went after. So I guess, again, it's, some things I think I could never do, and other people, for them, it's easy in a matter of course. So I think it's, again, about the talents that we all bring to the table.
Care and collaboration are always fundamental to me being a great leader. And I didn't own the care piece, I think probably until my 30s, because growing up as a little girl, I was like, you better take me seriously. I'm a tough little kid, And so, and also it was very kind of sporty, masculine context. So you wouldn't talk about care. But I coached little middle school girls in basketball when I was in high school. And I think that's when the care really came out for the first time. And then going on to a business school or working with military, again, like talking about care, especially as a woman, would be something that didn't feel comfortable. So and then collaboration was that other piece, and that's always been my thinking. It has been a very collaborative, integrative style. And then some things that really were fascinating is I always try to empower the people I work with. And I realized that showing them care and showing them that they could work well with others gave them a lot of confidence. And then I also had this great learning process that has affected every relationship of my whole life, which is that when people, watch out, this is shocking, when people know I care, they're more likely to work well with me, right? So, and I think there was another thing too about the care, which is that I'm actually a very hard driving leader, and I'm quite demanding of the people that work with me. And if I weren't so caring, I would be labeled something like a bitch, or it would be off-putting, right? And so this care and collaboration has always been a really important thing for me. And linking it to imagination, when I care about people, and I especially think about my middle schoolers, I'm actually more creative and more imaginative because I'm just kind of thinking about ideas and I'm thinking about them and I'm also living. So I've kind of entered a different mental and environmental interaction place. So I'm more creative. I'm also a better listener. And so they come up with interesting ideas or imaginative ideas. So I'm better able to capture and use imaginative ideas. What has worked is when we're in a group and people, Derek, to your point, people feel safe or they have permission to contribute. So to really stress kind of norms of contribution and also model it and reinforce it. So when someone contributes, even if it's not that strong, we celebrate it. So that's something that supported it. I think more active listening and encouraging the active listening of others, that it's not me as the leader to build on all of the ideas, but we can do it as a group. I think it creates a sense of trust and freedom. And there have been multiple solutions that were innovative, like in a group that was highly bureaucratic and highly constrained, when we had a meeting where someone actually broke out in tears. And the group stopped working and then came and took care of this person and then came back and started to have all these great ideas. I think because they no longer felt confined by task, they just felt like we're here together.
Do you believe imagination in leadership can be taught?
No. This is completely anecdotal, but from my experience, having done this for decades, you ever see the movie The Right Stuff? Mm-hmm. The thing is, this is like The Right Stuff. I think you can round off edges, you can polish something up, you can make people better at communication, teach them some principles in terms of leadership. You can do all of those things, but from my experience, I can't play basketball, and I can't play a musical instrument. I just can't, and I can't balance a checkbook. That's just me. So, and one of the problems in the military is that you expect everyone who wears a uniform to be a leader that goes with the territory. And yet I just have to say, some aren't. And the effort that it would take to make them marginally effective, particularly at intuitive leadership, would be so great that it's just not the gain isn't worth the pain. So what I get from that, and what Marty and I have been talking about for years, and what I'm still pursuing with this Mattis initiative, is maybe there's a way early on when people evince a desire to be a leader where you can put your arm around them and say, have you really thought about law school? I see too many people in my profession who are not leaders. Everybody knows it. They're miserable because deep inside their little hearts, they know they're not very good at this. And yet they're expected to be a leader and pretend as if they're a leader. And the final thing I'll say is that I just don't know how you know.
I find that you can teach leadership, that you can teach creativity. I haven't done imagination. I've only done creativity. You can teach those things. You can get the students involved in deliberate practice where you can see, yes, a lot of it is, stepwise. Deliberate practice is stepwise on purpose. And I can see huge amounts of improvement. Whether or not I can get every student to be, level to lead an entire army, I doubt it. But I can get them to be a lot better than they are now.
From all my research and all my personal experience, those who do extraordinary things, those who have the right stuff, the guy that's in that blown-up building, oftentimes is physically, emotionally, and intellectually the complete opposite of what you think that person should be. They're almost inevitably introverted. They're oftentimes small in stature. They tend to be not terribly smart. But there's some spark in them that when fear of violent death is raised to the point where everybody else is paralyzed, they all of a sudden that's what I meant by bottling it. They just the top of the bottle opens up and they show up. And here's the other thing that's so interesting. In the people that I've known who've done this, after it's over, they go back to mediocrity again.
I am a huge believer by my experience and by some that I have read of the power of environment, the power of the environment and the context that you operate in. I would have answered the initial question, that yes, you can encourage and nurture imagination and creativity. I think that just like you can encourage and value, hey, when the boss walks in the room, he or she is the person who walks in with the right answer. You can walk in and if this is a group of very diverse people, age, gender, everything, that you can say, I know the right answer is out there and I'm waiting to hear it from you, that you can cause people to think in more creative ways than they did when they walked in the door. And you do that repeatedly, and it has a nurturing effect. I've seen it in toxic environments, and I've seen people learn. General Dempsey is one of the best people, and it's not. You're not, in some way, it's not as crap your pants an experience, but you walk in to see the senior officer in the military and he asks you, hey, I've read the briefing book, what else can you tell me about Iran? You get really creative about sorting through what he might actually want to know about that and that is not in the briefing book. And General Dempsey developed people in an extraordinary way in my time on the Joint Staff.
As leaders, we should come up with imaginative products. And that there is a certain ability for some to develop those products and others don't have that ability. So I'm going to keep coming back to winning hearts and minds, which to me was an imaginative product. Did work, not work, we could talk about it, but boy, when I first heard it, I was like, that's not what the military does. That's imaginative. And so I'm just wondering whether or not we should be wrestling with, can we create groups of people who come up with these imaginative products?
There is work that I admire by a Princeton philosopher, Sarah Jane Leslie, who did work on this brilliance, the concept of brilliance in academic settings, and found ultimately that there's a strong correlation between this Fields feeling that you're born with it and sexism. A huge correlation. I counsel my students to be extremely careful about having a sense of entitlement based upon their feeling that they're born special, because ultimately it's exclusionary. And I know from seeing how VCs work that it is absolutely exclusionary.
Which institutional or other factors are barriers to imagination in leadership? So what's holding us back?
Years ago, when I worked at Harvard Business School, there was a professor, Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, you may know her name. She studied the fact that grades at HBS for the MBAs, more than 50% of the grade is participation. And she found that women generally weren't speaking up as much. And so, of course, their grades were being affected. And what Rosabeth said was the reason is that men think while they talk, women think before they talk. And so by virtue of that, fewer women were raising their hands, and she started cold calling. That leveled the playing field a bit.
The one, so far, indigestible minority in the military is women. Don't ask, don't tell, went by without a whisper. African Americans, the Korean War changed that, and by the time I went to war, it was, my last 3 bosses in the Pentagon were all African American. But after my daughters finished their 5 years of service, both of them, look, very bright girls because they're their mother's daughter, but they all came back with some sense of being not accepted. I asked my oldest daughter one time, I said, what's the worst thing you can do as a platoon leader? And she said, fall out of a run. I said, what does that mean? She says, well, if a guy falls out of the run, he got drunk last night and obviously can't make, but if a woman falls out of the run, then she can't hang. And this is really something that bothers me as a member of this military fraternity, of why it has been, and I don't think, to be honest with you, this incredible woman graduated in the second class to graduate females at the Naval Academy, class of '81, so she can sure speak to it more than I can. But both my daughters came back out of their military experience and telling me the reason they didn't stay in had nothing to do with manner of performance, it had everything to do with socialization, band of brothers, whatever the phrase you want to use is. And sexual harassment numbers are still to the roof. But more importantly, the acceptance of women in the tough parts of the military, I just don't see getting any better. The U.S. infantry still has 0 women after how many years?
We in the military are good at assessing cognitive skills. We're not able to assess non-cognitive skills, and what made me, what resonated with me was grit, just as an example. Not that your daughters lacked grit, but it may not have been valued. And we in the military tend to not value that which we cannot measure. We barely talk about it. This will matter to you. I've done 37 promotion boards. The average in a person's career is maybe 5 or 10, maybe. Yeah. So, but because a number of reasons, I've done 37 selection boards, and we take an oath not to discuss specifics, so I will just say broadly that technical competence comes up much more, and we kind of hand wave leadership, right? Well, of course they're a good leader, right? Of course, right? Because we wouldn't be talking about them if they weren't a good leader. So that assessment, and there's a lot packed into that assessment of non-cognitive skills that are part of leadership are very important, which is why I'm kind of interested to find Rick Rubel and find out what they looked at. But we don't put as much into learning from academia as we could.
I have a research project I've been working on for a while, and basically what we study is that there's a dark side to employees being proactive, coming up with new ideas, much of what Adam Grant works on. And what my research has shown is that if Maureen is a proactive employee, and we operationalize that by looking at whether or not she's her own leader, so she takes initiative, she solves problems, she doesn't come to me as her manager, how that version of proactivity can actually induce a sense of threat for leaders. And in turn, the threat can induce leaders undermining Maureen, so seeking to tear down her reputation, her relationships with others in the organization, and the work products that she produces. And so it's not just a cognitive reaction that we're threatened as leaders, but we actually are going to go above and beyond and sabotage the very behaviors that we're supposed to be supporting. The more interesting finding is that this process is more likely to occur when leaders are high on need for power. And what I find, so interesting about this is that you could be coming up, Maureen, as my employee with some new idea or, exercising imagination, but I'm the barrier to that. If I'm threatened by you, if I want to be the one as a leader who's dominating the discussion, having ideas that are used be my own, looking at our interaction as a zero-sum game.
That's a core motivation that most often relates to something that happened early in childhood or in development. It
Right.
can change, but it requires some strong emotional thing. And therefore, it's not something that can be changed by nurturing. And it needs some very tough and direct intervention to mitigate the side effects of need for power. I mean, and each of those motivations has their pros and cons.
Yep. So my solution, and I don't have this operationalized, but my theory, and I would love to actually see what your executives think, I think organizations need to leverage knowing that their leaders could be high on need for power and somehow link that to a reward structure where they're being rewarded for somehow supporting their employees, but having that linked back to fulfilling their own need. So let's say I'm high on narcissism and I work in an organization. I think senior management needs to figure that out, first of all, and then give me a goal that I think is important to fulfill for myself, but in fact, it would have the dual effect of also benefiting the organization. It's sometimes either or. Either I have a goal that I want to do and I get to win, the organization suffers, or I have to do something that benefits the organization and I lose. Why does it have to be either or?
Opposite problem, particularly acute, I've seen in talking about imagination in China. And that's the tall poppy problem.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That was the title of my paper.
Tall poppy.
Yeah.
What is that?
In China, you don't want to be a tall. There's enormous cultural pressure against being a tall poppy. Get cut down.
The lonely nail gets hammered
That
down.
was what I was going to say. Yeah.
But it's not only China. I think there's increasing pressure in the domains I know not to be a tall poppy.
Not to stand out.
Not to stand out. It's I'm talking quantitative here, not qualitative, but I worry that people are more afraid to be tall poppies these days.
But what is the implications of that? If that's the trend, what
Well,
does
it
the
means
what,
you don't hear imaginative ideas because people are afraid they're off the wall. They'll be a tall poppy.
That's Marty. That's really interesting in terms of like gifted and talent education. There are a lot of really, really talented, bright students that, because of cultural things, are too shy to reveal that because they don't want to be bullied. They don't want a lot of reasons. So I think that relates to what you're saying. There are a lot of people who are shy to be their full self.
other barriers besides culture that we might want to talk about that impedes imagination? Yeah.
So the first one, and I think this has been getting spoken to quite a bit. The first one that came to mind is just a very strong culture. So very strong cultural values that do not include or inhibitive of imagination. But the second one, this is a little more interesting to me, and I would love to hear if others know anything about this. The second one was bureaucracy. So, people have new ideas, they're shut down, or I bring my idea to my boss, can't do it, no budget, or I'd have to convince these people, what can happen? So I figure like that could be a barrier. And then at the same time, maybe it's the strength of the kind of tension or rigidity of that bureaucracy. Because if it's a bureaucracy and it's so rigid, people might actually be quite creative because they otherwise they can't get their work done. So they actually have to be highly imaginative because of these very rigid contexts. Whereas if it's a bureaucracy, but it's not that rigid, perhaps they wouldn't be feeling a need to be more imaginative.
I think some of the barriers in leadership is just being very outcome focused. And I think we are so focused on outcomes and that you can't, there's a very low tolerance for failure. And I also think that we look at best practices. Everything is best practices, best practices. So when I think about best practices, I think, well, gee, first someone had to think of best practices. And then they had to get the word out about best practices. And then you had to learn about them, and then you had to implement them. And by the time you're implementing, they're old practices. And we've missed all of this, opportunity for, other things. So I think, sometimes I wish people would just become in love with the problem and say, oh, let's generate lots and lots and lots of ideas and try lots of things. But we find something and we just kind of glob onto that.
I'll just share with you my big challenge. I focus on implicit theories of leadership. And so basically that's the stereotypes that we have about leaders. I'm trained in development, so I'm very interested in what an 8-year-old or a 16-year-old thinks about leaders. The way I get at it is ask them to draw a picture of a leader leading. Just that's it, a picture of a leader leading. And what they come up with is in this non-cognitive drawing is just always fascinating to look at. So the leader has a bigger head. The leader is taller. The leader is elevated. The list goes on and on. The leader is male. The leader there was one that I remember is literally helicoptering in, and all the people. It looked like, Germany in the 30s, kind of looking up. So I just think that as a tribe, as a guild, we have a responsibility to kind of change those implicit theories of leadership. No one is saying, well, leaders do perma, right? That's just, no one is saying that a leader is a servant, even though that we know that servant leadership is. These are not the implicit theories that people have. So I think until we change that, and somehow as intentionally as we can, I think then we'll be impeded in terms of the work that needs to be done. What is the biggest or most interesting problem? What's the big rock that you think needs to be addressed, perhaps even solved within leadership? So that's turning to our own discipline and applying some imagination to our own field.
You will never, I think, have an organization that does anything that's imaginative or creative if you don't have some way along the line of identifying, parsing, selecting, ordering people who have the talent. I disagree, I think, to some degree with Marty, is that I just think some have the right stuff and some don't. Some people are naturally creative, some people are naturally closed-minded, and if you want to build an organization that's made up of creative, well, not really. You can have part of your organization which is a mechanistic crank turner without imaginative people, but then you got to have another group over here where you can pick out those. And oh, by the way, from my experience, I found that sometimes even good judgment doesn't get it right.
So that's it's sort of the equivalent of analogous to the wicked problem. Because ultimately what I would love to see is leadership get broken down to being some definable set of skills that are mixed and matched, maybe in different ways. I mean, I do believe that. I actually, write that. But implicit learning is basically saying, okay, we're going to take some very complex situations and run you through them deliberately, very intensely, so you learn. It's sort of a deliberate practice, but
But not deliberate.
You're not doing it for a specific skill, but you're doing it for this very hard to define reaction, really. You're training reactions as opposed to definable skill sets.
What I was thinking of in terms of problem to address was very much related to what Payal, you were talking about earlier, and I think Marty, you also addressed it as well, which is how to make sure that leadership is always a win-win process. And I think if you're saying that we can link how the leader is doing to how the PERMA of people working with the leader, that's a way to make it a win-win situation. Yeah. I think those findings you talked about, Payal, I'm going to think about much more because it's disturbing and probably a really important problem to tackle, that a leader could be threatened by the performance of the people that they're working with.